Welcome back, everybody. This Week in America. Thank you for joining us on the program today. Website very simple, thisweekinamerica.us. As mentioned, our guest on the program today is Dr. Frank Elbert Davis III. He lives in Roanoke Rapids, North Carolina, attended UNC, receiving his AB in chemistry and MD. He was an intern at the hospital at the University of Pennsylvania and a resident at Eastern Virginia School of Medicine, Norfolk, Virginia. Dr. Davis is also the author of the book, What's Your Analysis Diagnosis? Truth or Fantasy? An Essay on Human Perception. And we're talking specifically in the program today about his newest book, The Nature of Science Today, Denial of the Truth Forms as Reality. Dr. Davis, welcome to This Week in America. Great to have you with us on the program.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be with you, Rick.
Looking forward to talking with you basically on both books. And let's talk a little bit about the background and why you decided to write these books. And there's so many interesting facets that you talk about in these. How did these books come about?
Well, in about 1986, so that's about 28 years ago, I became extremely interested in the psychiatric or psychoanalytic disorder of the narcissistic personality disorder. And I began an intensive study of that, reading Otto Kernberg's books and Heinz Kohut's books. And I felt that I had discovered what Freud would call the solution of his problem of structural development of personality, where I identified the fantasy worlds of the narcissistic personality disorders as defined by the American Psychiatric Association as the superego structures in personality as defined by Sigmund Freud in his works of the period about 1905. You know, he wrote for a long time, probably from 1895 to 1938, and he is considered the father of psychoanalysis. But he said that he thought these problems, this problem of structural development of personality, would be solved by a better understanding of narcissism, and that it would be solved by somebody outside of psychoanalysis. So he apparently felt like psychoanalysis or psychoanalysts had a prejudice that was obstructing them from being able to solve the structural development of personality. And indeed, if you study the history of psychoanalysis as presented through the relationship of Sandor Ferenczi and Dr. Masson, Jeffrey Masson, you find that psychoanalysis has a split ego, where the ego of knowing in psychoanalysis is split between the genetic causation or causes from our genes that would be hereditary, or environmental causes. And if you read really deeply about this, as I have, you discover that the psychoanalysts that have control of psychoanalysis today have a prejudice towards the endogenous or genetic causation of personality that obstructs their view of environmental causes. And even though you might carry out all of Koch's law to prove that there's a certain cause of personality, like a fantasy worldview, which is a parental worldview that is a superego structure, they will deny that. And in fact, they won't even listen to the idea as an explanation. So by not listening and by not giving the thought significant or adequate consideration, they obstruct their perception of it as reality.
You have studied this extensively. In the book we're talking about, actually several books written by Dr. Davis, The Nature of Science Today, Denial of the Truth Forms as Reality, and his other book, What's Your Analysis, Diagnosis, Truth or Fantasy? Professionally, when you put your thoughts out there, your research, your study out there, what feedback do you get from professionals? Are they receptive to what you're saying? What is the feedback?
Well, the reason the books actually resulted was, I discovered, I believed and still believe strongly after uh, at least 10 years of attempting to get this published in the psychoanalytic and psychiatric and psychological journals where it is ignored or denied publication. I have strongly felt that I've solved the problem, but I cannot get it published so that you may have heard, I don't know who wrote this, but somebody said one time that if you discover something really great, the first reaction of the experts in the field is to ignore you. And
Yes.
the second response is that they get very angry with you, but they don't discuss your thesis. And they don't realize that their prejudice is the antithesis of that thesis, so that they can't perceive the reality of your perception because they have a prejudice that is the opposite of your finding, your discovery, or your perception, so that they disagree with you and they simply don't feel it necessary to explain why they disagree with you, even though you may present clear reason why they're disagreeing with you is an unconscious prejudice for the endogenous or genetic causation. And you can even document their prejudice with their writings in psychoanalysis or psychiatry, and they will then try to deny that as what they were saying, so that they try to have it both ways all the time. And what that is what Freud called a split of their ego in the process of its defense, where when we're talking about the ego, we're talking about the knowing state or the knowing person or the knowing self-concept. They maintain their knowing by denying their not knowing, or by saying that it cannot be known what they are denying knowledge of,
Yeah.
so that they're just as smart as anybody else, and nobody will ever know, for example, the equation for the unified field because they don't know it, and they consider themselves smart. If you go to Thomas Kuhn, he wrote the book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He documents these stages where they first ignore you, and then the two sides compete for the public's attention, and ultimately some big area calling big enough to be called a revolution occurs in science. And science then makes a great leap forward because the thesis antithesis of genetic versus environmental is solved, and all of science then recognizes it as solved. And that's much better. That conscious state of solution is much better than the unconscious state of believing in the endogenous causation when the actual causation is the environmental causation.
You're listening
Or,
to This Week in America. I just mentioned where you get information written by Dr. Davis. Our guest is Dr. Frank Elbert Davis III. The book is called The Nature of Science Today, Denial of the Truth Forms as Reality. The other book is What's Your Analysis, Diagnosis, Truth or Fantasy? UnifiedFieldEquation.com is the doctor's website, information there. Information you can link onto our website, thisweekinamerica.us, and get information on that. I apologize for cutting you off there. I wanted to mention where you get information. And you've said several times the word solved. And sometimes I'm thinking people don't really want to solve a problem. It's much nicer when we still can talk, maybe even in abstract terms about it. When you mention solved, does that scare some people that they don't want the problem solved?
well, especially if it's contrary to their
Right, right.
prejudice of the solution. and they may not even be conscious that they have a prejudice. For example, the psychoanalysts say that the safest thing to say about personality is that most people believe that personality is neither environmental nor endogenous, but has some relationship between the two. But while Freud unequivocally in his writing solves the problem as the superego or parental factor as the cause of personality, he does so equivocally with his fellow professionals because he was so greatly criticized for believing that a relationship between a father or older brother most often caused the hysterical personality disorder. So that the psychoanalysts of his early days said, well, we know that these younger females are not raped by their father or their older brother, so therefore that is not the cause of hysteria. But they failed to recognize, as Ferenczi, another early psychoanalyst, points out, is the act of rape doesn't actually have to occur for them to have this as a mental image of their ideal self. If the relationship with the daughter, with the father, is that the only way he perceives her ideally is as an ideal sexual object, and he voices that in the way he talks to her and the way he relates to her, she then develops hysteria as an attempt to please her father and sees her father as the same person as every other male in her relationships. So then when she goes into psychoanalysis to get cured of her problem of hysteria, she projects onto the psychoanalyst her father's sexual way of thinking to them. They know that is not true of them, so therefore they say it's her endogenous overactive sexuality that causes this, but it's not actually her overactive sexuality, but it is her father's exclusive discussion of sexuality with her as an ideal object for him that she then projects onto every other person every other male person that she has a relationship with. So that what is true here is when Freud says that we relate socially to each other, Rick, as if our social objects or the people that we relate to, we tend to think of them as having the same superego or parental structure or parental identity that we had. And how else can you start in a relationship with somebody that you know nothing about except to project something upon them and then see how they react to it? So that all of us normally do some projective identification, and it's not always negative or untruthful. And when it's truthful, we come into an agreement with somebody. When it's untruthful, we have what's called the transference conflict. And then we learn about the other person by how they relate to that conflict. I run on. I could talk about this forever.
Well, it's a fascinating topic. And again, the name of the book is The Nature of Science Today, Denial of the Truth Forms as Reality. Our guest on the program is Dr. Frank Elbert Davis III. The book is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and at the doctor's website, unifiedfieldequation.com. A couple minutes left in the program. This fascination with you, this interest in the years of research you've done on this, does that go back to being a medical doctor? Does that go back to that practice? Was that first what got you interested in this?
No, I'd rather not share with you the reason for the details of the interest because it could be revealing of other humans' life and my opinion of
Right.
the way they think. And that could be sharing something that might be too intimate. But I do act out the process in the analysis of the psychoanalysts and the physicists in trying to show the public why they have not solved these problems and showing it as a personality disorder. Now, the scientific personality and disorder is simply a scientific personality that's not functioning to meet the needs of the situation. And in the case of psychoanalysis, the need of the situation is to identify the structural development of personality. And in the case of physics, it is to identify the unified field theory and be able to present that theory with the rigor of mathematics, so that, or with an equation, so that, I go through the relationship with these people in denial of my truthful discoveries as a way to show why they have not made the discoveries themselves. And of course, according to Freud, the reason the psychoanalysts have not made it is because they have a prejudice when they go in, or what you would call, if you think about Hegelian logic, there is the thesis that personality is caused by the environment. And there is the antithesis that personality is caused by genetics. If, according to Hegel, you choose either both as your solution, which is what the split ego does, trying to defend itself as knowing whether what it believes it knows is true or not, or by choosing the wrong thesis or antithesis, according to Hegel, you have nothing then. You haven't discovered anything. You don't know anything. The knowing ego is empty because you've either chosen the wrong solution or you've chosen both solutions, which then don't solve the problem. Now, you might recognize that computers work by on and off circuits, so that, just like Hegel, the computer understands, or the people that make computers understand, that every big problem can be split down into thousands of little parts. And then the circuit is either opened or closed on each part. It's either true or false on each part, and then you put all the parts together, and you have what's known as the bigger truth, or the holistic truth, that is composed of all the little truths. But then there's also the big lie that is composed of all the little lies, so that if you, in every case, make the wrong choice as to which way the circuit should go, you're going to have a lot of garbage, or you're going to have a large truth that's false.
This has been a fascinating discussion. Unfortunately, on this particular program, out of time. Would love to have Dr. Davis back with us. The guest on the program is Dr. Frank Elbert Davis III. The book, when we're talking about the nature of science today, Denial of the Truth Forms as Reality, also author of What's Your Analysis Diagnosis, Truth or Fantasy. His website is unifiedfieldequation.com. You can get a lot of information there, unifiedfieldequation.com. The book's available at Amazon, and of course you can go to our website, thisweekinamerica.us, and link on to Dr. Davis's website. Doctor, thank you for joining us. A lot of questions come out of that discussion. Would love to have you back on the program. Thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you for your patience, your listening, and the opportunity to be on your fantastic show.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to having you back. I've got a whole bunch of questions here from what you said during the course of the program. Interesting discussion. Once again, the guest on the program, Dr. Frank Elbert Davis III, the book, The Nature of Science Today, Denial of the Truth Forms as Reality. You're listening to This Week in America, website thisweekinamerica.us.